بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد خاتم النبيين وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحابته أجمعين والتابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So we were in our introduction to Arabic grammar and we reached the chapter of Al-Af'al Al-Naqisa. But just a quick recap. We are in the chapter of Al-Marfu'at, and that is the chapter of those words that will be in the Rafa' case, which is normally identified by a Dhamma. So again, we are in the chapter of Al-Marfu'at, and we are in the 7th chapter of, or sub-chapter of the main chapter of Al-Marfu'at. Okay, so the first was Al-Fa'il. The second was Na'ibul Fa'il. The third was Al-Mubtada. The fourth was Al-Khabar. The fifth was Al-Huruf Al-Mushabbahatu Bil-Fi'il, or also known as Inna wa Akhawatuha. And then was La li Nafyi al-Jins, or La allati li Nafyi al-Jins. And now we are in the chapter of Al-Af'alun Naqisa, and that just means the incomplete verbs. So we're in the chapter of Al-Af'al Al-Naqisa, and here there's a slight twist, because when we looked at the chapter of La allati li Nafyi al-Jins, the previous chapter, and the chapter of Inna wa Akhawatuha, or how the author wrote it as Al-Huruf Al-Mushabbahatu Bil-Fi'il, the previous chapter, the chapter before La allati li Nafyi al-Jins, you could see that the common pattern between both of those chapters were that the lam of La allati li Nafyi al-Jins, or all the particles that were under the chapter of Inna wa Akhawatuha, whenever they would come into the sentence, they would make the mubtada move from the rafa' case to the nasab case, and they would make the khabar stay and force it to stay put in the rafa' case. But now we're going to shift, and we're going to the next two chapters, which is Al-Af'al Al-Naqisa and Ma wala al-mushabbahatani bilaysa. And those two chapters is the opposite. So before, in the previous two chapters of Al-Huruf Al-Mushabbahatu Bil-Fi'il, which is Inna wa Akhawatuha, and La allati li Nafyi al-Jins, those huruf come into a sentence. Those particles come into a sentence and make the mubtada, the subject, move from the rafa' case to the nasab case. And they keep the khabar in the rafa' case. But in these chapters that we're going to go over now, they will basically do the opposite, and it gets flipped around. So when these huruf and when these words come into a sentence, they make the mubtada stay in the rafa' case, and they make the khabar move from the rafa' case to the nasab case. Okay, so Al-Af'alun Naqisa. So I've just described the ruling and how these certain verbs, when they come into a sentence, how they treat and how they deal with the words of that sentence. So I said that when these words, so the following words, كان صار أصبح أمسى أضحى ظل بات ما برح ما دام ما انفك ليس ما فتئ ما زال. So there are 13 words, or 13 basic, we have 13 verbs that you could add into a sentence, and when you add them into a sentence, the mubtada of that sentence will be in the rafa' case, and the khabar of that sentence will be in the nasab case. So again, the mubtada, the subject of the sentence that these words go into, the subject of that sentence will be in the rafa' case. It will remain in the rafa' case, and it will make the khabar, the information of that sentence, move from the rafa' case to the nasab case. So the author here, he brings an example, and the first example he mentions here is كان الرجل قائما. And just for the sake of making this very simple and mukhtasar, I'm not going to give the meaning and example for all these 13 words, because it's going to take too long. But we now know how these words work, and the author, he actually gives a few examples from himself. Okay, so here He mentions كان الرجل قائما, and he says the man was standing. So if you say الرجل قائم, the man is standing. الرجل قائم, they're both in the rafa' case, both with dhamma. If you bring kana into the mix, now you bring kana into the sentence, it's going to switch the structure of the sentence. And as I said earlier, it's going to make the mubtada, the subject of the sentence, remain in the rafa' case. So it's going to force it to remain in the rafa' case, and it's going to switch the information to be from the rafa' case to the nasab case. So الرجل قائم, الرجل is the mubtada, it's the subject of the sentence, and the khabar is قائم, and that's the information you're giving, that the man is standing. So the information is standing. So now when you bring kana into the mix and you say كان الرجل قائما, and you say the man was standing, you can see here that the mubtada remains in the rafa' case. الرجل, it remains and it keeps that dhamma there. It doesn't move the dhamma. The dhamma stays the same. But قائم goes to قائما because kana comes into this sentence. And kana switches the khabar, the information, to go from the rafa' case, which is dhamma, to the nasab case, which is fatha. So you say كان الرجل قائما with fathatain. Okay. And the second example that the author brings here is صار محمد عالما. So صار محمد عالما. So if you say محمد عالم, that means Muhammad, he's a alim, he's a knowledgeable man. Muhammad, he is knowledgeable. And now if you add صار, so we can see Muhammad is the subject, which is the mubtada, and then you have alim, which is the information, so it's the khabar. If you bring صار into the mix and you say صار محمد عالما, that means Muhammad became an alim. So when you say that, like I said earlier, you make the khabar, the information, switch from its original rafa' case, which was a dhamma, to the nasab case, which is fatha. So now you say صار محمد, محمد, the mubtada stays the same, and you say عالما, and you make the information go to the nasab case, which is fatha. Okay, and that's the second example. And he says here, for the third example, ليس الباب مفتوحا, ليس الباب مفتوحا. So if you said الباب مفتوح, الباب مفتوح, the door is open, you've given information. الباب is the subject of the information, and مفتوح, opened, that is the information you're giving about the door. So الباب مبتدا, مفتوح is khabar. When you bring laysa into the sentence, not, laysa means not. If you bring laysa into the sentence, then what happens is that, like I mentioned earlier, it's going to make the khabar switch from the rafa' case to the nasab case. So from dhamma to fatha, in the most common scenario, in the most common way of recognizing it, from a dhamma to a fatha, and it's going to keep the mubtada, which is al-bab, it's going to keep the mubtada in the rafa' case. So you say laysa al-babu maftuhan. Maftuh is the khabar, the information, so you make it move from rafa' case to the nasab case. So from dhamma to fatha. And this is the chapter of al-af'al al-naqisa. So the author, he brings 3 examples. And later, in the other books of Nahwa, we're going to go through the meaning of all these different huruf. But for now, your only task is to not worry about the meaning, because he's actually the author here, he's done something really amazing, and he's brought the 3 most famous words here that are commonly used. So he brought kana, sara, and laysa. Then the most commonly used words out of all these 13 words, he brings the 3 most used ones. So the 3 most used words in this chapter, he brings it here with examples. Okay, So this is the chapter of Al-Af'al Al-Naqisa. And the next book that we do for Nahu, we're going to go through the meanings of each one. So that is the chapter of Al-Af'al Al-Naqisa. And then the next chapter is, and it's the last subheading and subchapter of the overall chapter of Al-Marfu'at, those words that are in the Rafa' case. And why do we say, like for example, Kana is in the chapter of those words that will be in the Rafa' case? Why does Kana have to do anything with the chapter of Al-Marfu'at when the khabar is in the nasb case? When the khabar of Kana is in the nasb case, the khabar of the sentence that Kana comes into goes into the nasb case, why do we put it in the Marfu'at? The reason we put these chapters in the Marfu'at is because, for example, when you put Kana into a sentence, it keeps the mubtada in the Rafa' case. That's why we put the chapter of Kana into the Marfu'at, the chapter of all those words that are in Rafa', because the mubtada of it is in the Rafa' case. And similarly, Inna wa akhawatuha, the chapter of Inna, the khabar will have the Rafa' case, which is why, because the khabar will have the Rafa' case, we're going to bring that into the chapter of Al-Marfu'at. And same goes for Allati li nafi al-jins. The khabar will be in the Rafa' case, which is why we brought it into the Marfu'at section. Okay, so we didn't bring the chapter of Kana. We didn't bring it into this chapter because the khabar is in nasb case. We brought it because the mubtada is in the Rafa' case. Okay, and this is the next chapter of Ma wala al-mushabbahatani bilaysa. And that means Ma wala, that particle ma and that particle lam alif, that are similar and work exactly the same way as laysa. So we mentioned in the previous chapter that laysa, it means not, and it was part of those 13 words that when they go into a sentence, so laysa is part of them, that when these certain words, these 13 words which laysa is a part of, when they go into a sentence, they keep the mubtada, the subject of that sentence, in the rafa' case, and they move the information of that sentence from the rafa' case to the nasab case. So that is the action of laysa, because laysa is one of them. So when laysa goes into a sentence, the information goes into the nasab case. So the information, the khabar, goes from the rafa' case to the nasab case, and the mubtada, the subject, goes from or stays in the rafa' case. So here the ma and la of this chapter work exactly the same as laysa, and they do the same exact action to the sentence. So this ma and this la of negation, because they both are here to negate stuff, they both carry the meaning of negating. So this ma and la of negation, when they go into a sentence, they do the same thing laysa does. So this ma and la, when they go into a sentence, they make the mubtada stay in the rafa' case, and they make the information go from the rafa' case to the nasab case. Okay, so this is the chapter of Ma wala al-mushabbahatani bilaysa, and the author gives two examples. And he gives the example Ma Zaydun qa'iman, and he says that Zayd is not standing. Okay, Ma Zaydun qa'iman, Zayd is not standing. So Zaydun qa'imun means Zayd is standing. The mubtada, the subject, is Zayd. The information which you're giving about him, which is standing, you're telling everyone that he's standing, that's the information, that's the khabar here. So now, as we mentioned, ma makes the khabar go into the nasab case. So now you're going to say Ma Zaydun qa'iman, because qa'im is the information of the sentence, and ma, this ma and la, they make the information of the sentence move from the rafa' case to the nasab case, and it keeps the mubtada, the subject of the sentence, and it keeps it and makes it remain in the rafa' case, which is why Zayd stays with the dhamma, and which is why qa'imun goes from qa'imun to qa'iman. So it moves from dhamma to fatha because of the ma. It works exactly as laysa does. And then the second example is la rajulun jalisan. A man is not sitting. So if you say rajulun jalisun, that means a sitting man. Now when you say la rajulun qa'iman, when you say la rajulun qa'iman, then the rajul moves and becomes the mubtada of that sentence. So the rajulun is the mubtada. You're talking about the man or a man. You're talking about a man. And jalisan, which he mentions here, la rajulun jalisan, is the information of the sentence, because you're giving information about a man. So you say la rajulun jalisan. And as I mentioned earlier, and for the previous chapter, that this word la and ma follows laysa. And what is that action that laysa does, and this ma and la, what do? They make the mubtada, which is rajul in this sentence, stay in the rafa' case, and they make the khabar, the information, which is jalis in this sentence, in this case, go from the rafa' case to the nasab case. So it goes from jalisun to jalisa. So you say la rajulun jalisan. So it makes the khabar, the information, go from a dhamma to a fatha, and it keeps the mubtada and the subject, it keeps it and it makes it continue to have a dhamma on it. So you say la rajulun qa'iman. And now the grammarians do mention like a few conditions for when you use the la. So ma, you can use it whenever you want, but then they mention, when do you use the la? Can you use it for specific words or unspecific words? So that is a discussion that we will go into, but what I will mention actually here is that about the la, whether it comes for specific words or unspecific words. So Ibn Malik mentions in his Alfiya that la في النكرات أعملت كليس لا وقد تليلات وإن ذا العمل. So في النكرات أعملت كليس لا. If you want to memorize that, you can. في النكرات, and only in unspecific words. In unspecific words, أعملت كليس لا. Then la, you can use it like that to negate stuff. In unspecific words, which is why you can see the mu'allif, the author here, he actually brings rajul and he doesn't bring zayd, because rajul is an unspecific word. You say a man, it could be any man, so it's an unspecific word, which is why he brought rajul and he did not mention zayd, because zayd is a name, so it becomes a specific word. So that's the difference between ma and la that the grammarians mention, that the Arabs, they normally mention ma for specific words, and la, specifically this la, for unspecific words. So Ibn Malik mentions in his Alfiya, he says في النكرات أعملت كليس لا. That's what he mentions in his Alfiya. And this was the chapter of Al-Af'al al-Naqisa and Ma wala al-Mushabbahatani bilaysa. And from the next lesson we're going to go into the chapter of Al-Majrurat next. And there's only two, so it's going to be very, very short. So in the next lesson, we're going to go over the chapter of Al-Majrurat, those words that are going to be in the jar case. So this was the chapter of Al-Af'al al-Naqisa. كان صار أصبح أمسى أضحى ظل بات ما برح ما دام ما انفكى ليس فتئ ما زال. So, and this was also the chapter of ما ولا المشبهتان بليس. Any mistake I made was from me and shaitan, and Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam are both free from it. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.